Shakti is alive through you, yet Kundalini is called the sleeping goddess. The yogic maps place that concentrated power at the root of the central subtle axis. Breath, desire, fear, memory, and speech stay active while this deeper current remains latent. The answer is simple. Shakti moves everywhere. Kundalini gathers at the root, and central awakening changes what all that power serves. From there, the Nadis explain the paradox clearly. The Hatha Yoga Pradipika gives this old map real precision. It describes Kundalini as sleeping, then links her awakening with the piercing of the lotuses and knots, and with Sushumna becoming the main road for prana. That gives us the first answer early. Sleep describes concentrated awakening potential at the central gate, while Shakti remains active through embodied life. Shakti is the active power of ultimate reality in the Shaiva-Shakta frame we are using here. Kundalini is that power read through the yogic body as concentrated awakening potential. The Nadis are subtle channels in that sacred body map, and the central route receives special importance because liberation is tied to how force, attention, and identity become organized. So why place the goddess near the root of the spinal axis? Old maps place her there. In the reading we are building here, the root gathers foundation, embodiment, generative force, gravity, and the beginning of the central ascent. The image becomes intimate fast. She is placed where spirituality has to meet work, sleep, grief, sexuality, aging, family, hunger, fear, and every ordinary day carried through this body. That brings the subject back into embodiment. A person can collect chakra vocabulary for 20 years and still treat the body like luggage. Tantra brings the sacred into the vessel. The goddess at the root asks whether divine power becomes recognizable through the whole human system: posture, appetite, speech, desire, memory, relationship, responsibility, and the way attention gets spent. The Nadi map now gives us the next layer, because activity and latency can live inside the same body. A Nadi belongs to traditional subtle body language. The nervous system is a physical map. Blood vessels, fascia, hormones, respiration, and the spinal cord belong to physical description. Nadi language tracks prana, attention, contemplative experience, and transformation through a different sacred geography. Later, modern interpreters drew correspondences between that geography and physical anatomy. Keeping those categories clean gives the old map more strength. The subtle body stands as its own yogic language, while physical anatomy keeps its own standards of evidence. Traditional practitioners treated prana, sensation, breath, attention, sexual force, mental state, and contemplative absorption as connected features of embodied practice. The map was built for transformation. Ida and Pingala are commonly presented as lateral channels, while Sushumna holds the central place. Texts and lineages vary in chakra counts, intersections, subsidiary channels, deities, sounds, and symbolic details. That variation points toward a family of sacred maps built for different yogic and ritual purposes. Across that family, one idea keeps returning with serious force. Ordinary pranic life can stay distributed through the network, while the central route associated with liberation remains latent. There is your sleeping goddess again. You wake up in the morning and the system is already active. A sound pulls attention toward the window. Hunger pulls attention toward the kitchen. A message on the phone changes the chest. An old memory changes the face before you even choose a sentence. Attraction can change the pelvis. Fear can change the jaw. Grief can change the throat. The body is alive with traffic. Tantra looks at all that traffic and asks a sharper question. Does the movement keep reinforcing the same limited identity, or does the movement begin returning the conscious being toward recognition of the source? That is why the Nadi map gives us more than 3 exotic words. It gives us a way to understand distributed life force versus central awakening, Ida and Pingala become part of the ordinary polarity of embodied life, cooling and heating, receptive and active, lunar and solar, inward and outward associations depending on the lineage. Sushumna represents a central passage where those polarities are gathered into another order. The key word is central. In the yogic map, centrality points toward integration, ascent, and liberating orientation. Huge activity can fill the side currents, while the same compulsions keep running the person. Power can feel enormous, while fear keeps steering. Spiritual emotion can feel intense, while identity stays fragmented. Sexual charge can rise while clarity stays weak. Force proves the presence of force. Its direction tells you what the force is serving. That point becomes more important with age. A younger body can sometimes hide disorder behind raw vitality. The system can recover from scattered sleep, emotional storms, careless appetite, constant stimulation, and years of reaction, simply because the organism has more reserve. Later in life, the bill becomes easier to read. Energy can still be present, yet its distribution becomes obvious. You feel which conversations drain the chest. You know which habits scatter the mind. You can tell when desire leaves the body brighter and when it leaves the system dull. You notice how resentment sits in the shoulders for years. You notice how a family role can keep the belly braced even after the original conflict is gone. That is body as laboratory wisdom. It requires enough seriousness to observe the body while leaving ordinary sensations in their proper context. It requires enough seriousness to observe that power is always being spent somewhere. The sleeping goddess image says divine force can be fully present as life, while the central liberating orientation remains folded into ordinary identity. Universal Shakti remains continuously active. Kundalini is the same power gathered at the root inside the yogic awakening map. Activity fills the system, recognition changes the center. If the Shakti-Kundalini distinction changed the whole subject for you, like the video, now take one more layer. The old image of the coil carries meaning. A coil stores potential while retaining power. A spring can remain compressed. A seed can contain a whole tree before branches appear. A sleeping animal can be alive, breathing, warm, and capable of enormous movement while remaining in another mode. The image works because latency and life can occupy the same body at once. Kundalini is often represented as coiled near the root, sometimes in relation to the entrance of Sushumna. The image says, concentrated power rests at the threshold of the central root. Her sleep guards a passage. Her waking changes the use of that passage. And this is where the spine becomes spiritually interesting. Your spine is the physical axis around which the body organizes posture, movement, head, pelvis, and orientation. The yogic map uses that axis as subtle geography. It places chakras along a central line and makes the root to crown direction an image of transformation. That language gives the body a vertical story, while the spinal cord stays inside physical anatomy. The distinction is clean. Physical anatomy describes tissues and nerves. Subtle anatomy describes prana, attention, contemplative states, and symbolic transformation. Both maps can speak to the same human being from different levels, while preserving their own categories. This protects you from the internet version, where every twitch becomes a chakra and every warm sensation becomes proof of enlightenment. A warm back is a warm back until more context gives it meaning. Tingling can happen for countless reasons. Emotional arousal can create powerful body sensations. Sleep loss can make perception strange. Meditation can alter body awareness. A spiritual interpretation can coexist with sensible discernment. The old maps gain strength when they are allowed to be yogic maps. Their purpose is transformation. They ask what happens to prana, attention, identity, and liberation when the body becomes part of the path. That is a different question from the one a modern anatomy textbook answers. When Kundalini gets placed on the spinal axis, hear the deeper point. The tradition places Shakti on the central human axis and describes the possibility that power gathered at the root can enter a liberating route through the subtle body. The Hatha Yoga Pradipika makes the sequence direct: sleeping Kundalini, the opening of lotuses and knots, and Sushumna becoming the principal road for prana. Later in the lesson, the Shiva-Samhita sharpens the channel map by placing Sushumna between Ida and Pingala and associating Kundalini with the opening at its base. Those details give She Sleeps a real source root. The Shiva-Samhita adds another useful layer. It describes a wider network of subtle channels, names Sushumna, Ida, and Pingala among the principal roots, places Sushumna between the two lateral channels, and associates Kundalini with the opening at its base. It also presents Kundalini as divine power rather than a loose electrical metaphor. That is important for this subject. The sleeping figure is Shakti gathered into a specific yogic location, while the same sacred power remains active through the rest of embodied life. So the paradox sharpens. The goddess can animate appetite, movement, thought, speech, reproduction, memory, and attention, while her central liberating form stays gathered at the gate. The old map is describing two scales of the same power: distributed activity and concentrated awakening potential. That distinction gives the Nadi language real purpose. Ida and Pingala help describe the traffic of polarity. Sushumna marks the privileged central route. Kundalini gives the concentrated power at the threshold. Shakti gives the cosmic identity of the force moving through the whole picture. The architecture is clear: root, central passage, lateral currents, knots, sleeping power, ascent, union. Each part adds a different piece of the body map. The root says embodiment comes first. The lateral currents say life already moves through polarity. The knots say repetition can become structure. The sleeping power says potential can remain latent for years. The central passage says integration requires a different order than simply producing more stimulation. The ascent says transformation changes the organization of the whole person. The meeting at the crown, in traditions that use that imagery, says Shakti recognizes or reunites with Shiva, consciousness and power known as one reality. That final point takes us into the heart of the goddess. Shiva names pure consciousness in this philosophical language. Shakti names active manifestation. Shakti is movement, expression, becoming, vibration, creation, speech, desire, intelligence, embodiment. In non-dual Shaiva and Shakta ways of seeing, the world is a real expression of ultimate reality. The world is the power of that reality appearing. Your body belongs to that appearance. Thought belongs to it. Sensation belongs to it. The force that can become fear, love, sex, art, anger, grief, devotion, or silence belongs to it. Kundalini then becomes intensely personal and remains cosmic. She is cosmic Shakti, read through one embodied center. The universal power appears as a localized potential for recognition. That is why calling her a goddess has more depth than turning a body current into a female cartoon character. The goddess form gives intelligence, relationship, reverence, and sacred agency to the force. A practitioner can approach Shakti as divine presence rather than as fuel to be exploited. The language changes the posture of the ego. You are dealing with the active face of ultimate reality, a force far greater than a battery for personal use. And the word sleep becomes almost provocative here. Ultimate reality has power everywhere. Why would its power sleep? Because the sleep belongs to the condition of recognition inside the individual map. Shakti fills manifestation with activity. localized Kundalini is portrayed as dormant relative to the liberating central movement. That difference lets us say something precise. The goddess wakes as the individual system changes its relationship with power. The universe was already alive. A person can use Shakti to strengthen the identity that keeps recognition hidden. Ambition shows it clearly. Ambition can build a business, feed a family, create beauty, organize a community, or become a private hunger for rank. Sexual force can create tenderness and life, or get trapped in possession and fantasy. Speech can bless a room, repair a relationship, or keep feeding a wound. The force stays sacred. The pattern decides where it goes. Same life, different organization. This is why Tantra becomes serious very quickly. The force you want to awaken is already showing you what it serves every day. The question is written in your habits long before it is written in mystical visions. You can see it when an old insult from 15 years ago still changes your breathing in 5 seconds. You can see it when one person's name appears on a screen and the belly immediately prepares for war. You can see it when desire hijacks attention so thoroughly that the conscious being in this body watches the body-mind perform a routine it already promised to leave behind. You can see it when praise fills the chest and criticism empties it. Prana, in the yogic reading, participates in those grooves. Karma becomes more than a cosmic scorecard. Repeated action, reaction, attention, and identity create channels of familiarity. Now we have a useful bridge between karma and Nadi language. I am using the word channel carefully here. A Nadi is a traditional subtle channel. A karmic groove is a repeated pattern of action and identification. They belong to different explanatory layers, yet the traditions often bring energy and conditioning into the same conversation. Because repeated life creates tendencies, and tendencies influence where attention and force keep going. An old city gives us a useful picture. Its roads were built by millions of repeated trips. The city grew from countless journeys rather than one conscious master plan. Residents kept walking certain routes. Paths became lanes, lanes became roads, businesses appeared beside them, traffic lights followed. Years later, the residents called those roads normal. Repetition had become infrastructure. The body-mind can feel exactly like that. A reaction repeats until it feels like personality. A fear repeats until it feels like wisdom. A craving repeats until it feels like need. A role repeats until it feels like self. The goddess is still the power moving through the city. Kundalini sleep describes the deeper center remaining latent while the old roads keep receiving almost all the traffic. That image carries weight because awakening then becomes more intelligent than a simple upward energy story. Awakening means the entire map begins to reorganize around a deeper center. The old language of Sushumna gives that center a route. Ida and Pingala remain part of embodied life. Polarity still exists. You still have to eat, sleep, speak, work, age, relate, pay bills, answer messages, and live inside time. Centralization includes the human world inside a deeper order. It changes the throne from which the human world is experienced. That is why true Kundalini language eventually collides with identity. The power rises toward recognition, because the person who thought they owned the power starts becoming transparent to the source of it. The goddess wakes, and the little owner begins losing his monopoly on the sense of me. There is a reason the sleeping image can become more useful in ordinary life than a dramatic awakening story. A dramatic story gives the mind something rare to admire. Sleep gives you something daily to examine. Sleep means a power can be present while its highest possibility stays unused. You have seen this in human beings forever. A talented musician can spend 10 years avoiding the instrument. A loving person can spend a decade defending one wound. A brilliant mind can become a servant of comparison. A strong body can carry fear in the same posture every morning. Capacity and expression are separate questions. Kundalini symbolism places that truth inside the sacred body. You may have a day where everything appears normal. You get dressed, you make coffee or tea, you answer a message, you drive somewhere or walk somewhere. You sit across from a person you have known for years. Then, one sentence hits an old pattern. The shoulders change, the lower belly tightens. The mind begins assembling evidence from 2009, 2014, and last Tuesday. The body prepares the same defense it has prepared 100 times. There is Shakti. Power is moving. Memory has power. Speech has power. Attention has power. The body's defensive intelligence has power. Yet the movement is still being organized through old identity. Now take another scene. You feel attraction. Immediately, imagination starts building a future, a fantasy, a possession, a fear of losing, or a need for confirmation. Again, power is moving. The force can be beautiful. Desire can open the heart, create relationship, produce art, and expose hidden hunger. The same force can also narrow attention until the person becomes an object in your private story. Again, Shakti is active. Kundalini sleep says the deepest possibility of that force remains folded into a smaller use. Grief gives another example. A photograph appears while you are cleaning a drawer. The throat changes. Time folds. The body from today meets the body from 20 years ago. Tears may come or the chest may harden. That grief carries power. It can become memory, tenderness, avoidance, bitterness, prayer, or a deeper recognition that every form you love lives under time. Tantra has room for that. The goddess includes pleasant sensation, painful sensation, creation, disruption, and the whole field. Shakti appears as the force of the whole field. Fierce feminine traditions understood that beauty, terror, sexuality, death, creation, and destruction can all belong to one divine power. The question becomes how the conscious being meets that power. She hides through intimacy. She is so close that the personality mistakes her movements for me. Anger rises and the sentence becomes, I am angry. Fear rises and I am afraid. Desire rises and I need this. Memory rises and this is who I have always been. A current appears and identity signs its name underneath it. The deeper path begins when the conscious being can feel power and keep identity wider than the movement passing through. That can make emotion cleaner while preserving its human warmth. Anger can move and still leave room for intelligence. Desire can stay alive while possession loses authority. Grief can carry love while identity stays larger than the wound. Fear can report danger while the next decision comes from a wider center. This is where Shakti becomes teacher. Every force exposes the relationship between awareness and movement. In the non-dual Shaiva-Shakta frame we are using here, Shiva and Shakti are inseparable. Consciousness and its power belong together. The individual path therefore becomes recognition, where awareness and energy are known as one living reality. Power stops appearing as foreign material invading consciousness and becomes the activity of consciousness itself. The sleeping Kundalini image says the relationship is still contracted. Shakti is moving through limited channels of identification. The waking image says the relationship opens towards central recognition. Because the body is the laboratory, hints of reorganization show up in ordinary consequences. A reaction can lose some automatic speed. A conversation can hold more space before the old defense takes over. Desire can stay strong while the conscious being has more choice. A painful memory can move through the body while another reality remains available in the room. Attention can stay gathered longer. Silence can become easier to inhabit. Those changes sound humble beside visions, heat, shaking, bliss. lights, inner sound, spontaneous movements, or the other phenomena people sometimes associate with Kundalini. Humble changes are often harder to fake. Anybody can become impressed by intensity. Character requires time. The spinal image opens into a whole body subtle map. Root, channels, chakras, knots, prana, attention, consciousness, and liberation belong to one ecology. The spine serves as the dramatic vertical landmark inside that larger field. The Nadis make that ecology visible. Traditional texts describe large networks of subtle channels, and their abundance carries a simple point. Life force is distributed. 3 channels become especially useful because they summarize lateral polarity and central integration. Ida and Pingala give us the dance. Sushumna gives us the axis. Kundalini gives us the latent power. Shakti gives us the cosmic identity of that power. She sleeps becomes almost confrontational here. She sleeps while the body is busy. She sleeps while the mind can talk for 12 hours. She sleeps while desire creates private worlds. She sleeps while fear creates entire futures. She sleeps while spiritual vocabulary piles up. Activity fills the city while the central gate stays quiet. Her sleep is concentrated possibility. The power is present. Its liberating orientation is gathered. The deeper reason that possibility stays concentrated appears in what the system has learned to call itself. Identity is where the map turns. A sleeping power at the root can sound like a technical problem waiting for a technical solution. That framing makes the ego imagine a switch, a special breath, a secret posture, a teacher pressing a button, or a dramatic event that suddenly turns the system on. The deeper tantric map points towards something more demanding. The force is already active. The contracted identity is using that force to keep reproducing itself. Every time the mind says me, it gathers a huge history behind one tiny word: my body, my reputation, my partner, my children, my money, my pain, my opinion, my spiritual progress, my past, my future. Some of those relationships are necessary for life. You need a name, you need memory, you need boundaries, you need to know which bank account belongs to you and which child you promised to pick up. The spiritual problem appears when functional identity becomes ultimate identity. Then Shakti spends herself protecting a contraction. A criticism comes in and power rushes to defend the image. A compliment comes in and power rushes to enlarge the image. Someone younger succeeds and power rushes into comparison. Someone you love withdraws and power rushes into panic. The body ages and power rushes into resistance. A spiritual experience happens and power rushes into the belief that the person is becoming advanced. Same goddess, same creative force, different altar. This is where the word Kundalini becomes more than an esoteric topic. Kundalini is the possibility that power ceases to circulate only around the small center and becomes transparent to a deeper identity. In non-dual Shaiva language, recognition is central. The individual consciousness discovers its identity with the wider field of consciousness. Shakti is the power through which that field manifests, contracts, hides, seeks, remembers, and recognizes. The path can therefore be described as a reversal of contraction. That gives sleep another layer. Sleep is self-forgetting. The goddess hides by becoming everything you take for granted. She becomes the energy inside your next thought, and the thought claims ownership. She becomes the force inside attraction, and desire claims ownership. She becomes the body's intelligence, and the personality claims ownership. She becomes speech, and the mouth claims the words. She becomes attention, and the mind claims the focus. She becomes spiritual hunger, and the seeker claims the awakening. The game is almost perfect because the power that could expose the limited identity is the same power the limited identity uses to defend itself. More energy can amplify the identity already holding the steering wheel. More force can feed more fear. More charisma can feed more vanity. more sexual charge can feed more obsession. More attention can feed more control. More mystical intensity can feed a stronger spiritual persona. The quality of identity determines the direction of the added power. Intensity changes volume, recognition changes identity. That is one of the cleanest ways to separate Kundalini spectacle from Kundalini wisdom. The old central channel imagery becomes powerful here. Sushumna symbolizes or describes a route where the polar traffic is gathered toward liberation. In some Hatha maps, the awakening of Kundalini and her movement through the central channel pierce the knots that bind the system. Those knots can be approached as subtle obstructions inside the traditional map. While conditioned contraction offers a separate modern analogy, the image still says something precise. Power meets what has become fixed. A knot is accumulated relationship. Pull one side and another side tightens. Old fear can tie itself to love. Duty can tie itself to resentment. Sex can tie itself to shame. Money can tie itself to survival memory. Religion can tie devotion to fear. Family can tie belonging to silence. Spiritual identity can tie humility to the need to appear humble. That is why a knot image works better than the internet fantasy of an empty tube waiting for fire. Human beings are patterned. An adult can suddenly realize that every disagreement with a grown child activates the tone absorbed from a parent decades earlier. Another person can realize that receiving affection still triggers an old childhood expectation that love comes with a price. Someone who has spent years carrying a family can discover that the body braces before asking for help. These are living knots: relationship, memory, body response, and identity tightening together. Those are the places where spiritual teaching has to touch real life. A chakra story can leave old roles exactly where they were. Deeper awakening changes how the conscious being sees power participating in those roles. The Nadi map then becomes more than esoteric anatomy. It becomes a way of asking where life force keeps getting recruited by inherited identity. Psychological conditioning and Nadi language remain distinct explanatory categories. The categories stay clean. Psychological conditioning has its own language. Trauma has its own clinical language. Nervous system responses have their own science. Nadi and granthi belong to the yogic subtle body system. Different maps can illuminate the same human life while preserving distinct objects of explanation. The traditions themselves give us permission to respect complexity because their subtle body maps vary. Chakra number, channel detail, location, deity, mantra, and cosmological interpretation can change across texts and lineages. The constant is the transformational intent. Embodied power can move from contracted organization toward liberation. Here is the deeper turn. The greatest hiding place is the activity itself. The same Shakti feeding ambition, sex, grief, speech, family, duty, prayer, fear, and spiritual hunger can keep feeding the identity that claims each current as me. That means distributed activity can conceal source through sheer familiarity. Sushumna then becomes the image of those forces returning under one center. The question shifts from how much energy is moving to what identity that energy is serving. This also gives the old language of knots more depth. A granthi is a binding point in the subtle body vocabulary, and the image works because a knot is created by relationship between strands. One strand alone gives you a line. Several strands pulled together can produce a structure that resists movement. Human identity behaves in a similar way. Memory can bind to fear. Duty can bind to resentment. Sexuality can bind to shame. Love can bind to control. Spiritual hunger can bind to comparison. The traditional knot and the psychological pattern belong to different explanatory categories. Yet the analogy becomes useful when we keep that distinction clear. The yogic map says central ascent encounters binding. Ordinary life shows how binding can feel. The same reaction returns, the same body region braces, the same sentence appears, the same role takes command. Waking the goddess then becomes a bigger idea than producing sensation. It means power meets the structures that keep distributing life force through familiar identity. A central root has to pass through what has been tied together over years. That is why an awakening worth respecting can reorganize relationships, speech, desire, fear, work, and self-description along with the inner experience. That shift changes the whole subject. The body becomes temple, desire becomes information, fear becomes a force that exposes identification. Speech becomes creative power that carries consequence. Sexual force becomes sacred, generative energy that asks for responsibility. Grief becomes love moving through impermanence. Ordinary life becomes the place where centrality proves itself, and the spine becomes an axis of remembrance. The root carries condensed potential. The central route carries the image of ascent. The crown carries the image of union or recognition. Between them sit the centers and knots through which the tradition dramatizes the transformation of embodied consciousness. Comment, "She sleeps" if the Nadi map is clear for you. There is still one problem we have to handle carefully, because modern spiritual language has blurred physical anatomy, subtle anatomy, psychology, and mystical experience so thoroughly that people can hear the same word and imagine four different things. The word channel makes the distinction easy. A neurologist can describe nerve pathways, a vascular specialist can describe arteries and veins, a physiotherapist can describe movement chains, a psychologist can describe learned patterns of attention and response, a yogic text can describe nadis. Those maps overlap inside one living person, yet each map earns clarity by keeping its own terms. Subtle body traditions developed multiple distinct maps. Different systems placed different numbers of chakras along the axis. Some emphasize 6 centers, later popular systems often emphasize 7. And other lineages use additional arrangements. Channel maps, deities, seed syllables, elements, petals, and cosmological correspondences also vary. That diversity points toward multiple lineage maps built for different ritual and yogic purposes. The subtle body works best here as sacred geography, a map built for transformation. It organizes contemplative experience, ritual symbolism, pranic theory, and liberation into a body-shaped language. That map can still feel startlingly practical because every human being already experiences life through an axis. You know the difference between being collapsed and upright. You know how fear can pull the body inward. You know how confidence changes the way the head sits over the chest. You know how shame can change where the eyes go. You know how grief can change the front of the body. Those observations belong to ordinary embodied life. The yogic map takes embodiment much further and speaks about prana, centers, channels, and liberation. Later modern interpreters increasingly correlated that inner geography with nerves, plexuses, glands, and the brain. Those comparisons helped modern audiences approach unfamiliar concepts, while the older subtle body maps kept their own symbolic ritual and yogic logic. So keep the layers clean. Sushumna is a central subtle channel in the traditional map. The spinal cord is a physical structure. Chakras are centers within subtle body systems. Nerve plexuses and endocrine glands are physical structures. A teacher can compare them carefully, and the categories should stay visible whenever the language crosses from one map into another. That one distinction saves you from a lot of spiritual nonsense. The spinal image gains more depth here. The physical axis gives the sacred map a place of intimacy, while the Nadi system keeps the teaching larger than one anatomical structure. Now look at Ida and Pingala again. Popular diagrams show them winding around a central axis and meeting around chakra points. That image can be useful as a visual summary of polarity. One current is often associated with lunar, cooling, receptive qualities, the other with solar, heating, active qualities. Lineages differ in their details and applications. The larger teaching is that ordinary embodied life moves through differentiated forces. Human life itself confirms the usefulness of polarity as a teaching image. You act and receive, speak and listen, heat up and cool down, reach outward and return inward, work and rest, desire and release, protect and soften, analyze and intuit. The mistake begins when one side becomes sacred and the other side becomes shameful. Tantric non-duality has a sharper view. Shakti includes the whole field. Polarity belongs to embodied life. The map gives it rhythm rather than moral rank. Receptivity and expression, cooling and heating, rest and exertion, inward attention and outward action all have their season. Ida and Pingala become useful because they keep the path from pretending that liberation requires a flat human being. A centered person can still become passionate, quiet, forceful, tender, tired, alert, sexual, contemplative, social, and solitary. The deeper question is whether these movements keep pulling identity into separate little kingdoms. Sushumna gathers the image of a center that can hold the whole dance. The goddess wakes through integration of power, and polarity becomes expression rather than fragmentation. The central path brings polarity under a deeper center. Action stays available, receptivity stays available, desire can move while awareness stays wider than desire. Fear can move while intelligence keeps the throne. Grief can stay alive while identity stays larger than grief. The currents remain. The center becomes clearer. Sushumna gives us a language for integration while the original map stays yogic and subtle. The body, attention, prana, and liberation remain connected inside the traditional frame. There is another part of the map. Prana is often divided into functional movements, sometimes called vayus. The upward, downward, inward, outward, and distributing movements give the old system more nuance than a simple upward energy story. Kundalini awakening sits inside a larger economy of life force. That carries weight because a human body already lives through digestion, elimination, respiration, circulation, speech, movement, sexuality, sleep, and attention. A spiritual map that ignores the rest of life becomes fantasy very quickly. The old systems were interested in the whole vessel. Even the root location carries whole body seriousness. Muladhara is tied to foundation and the beginning of the ascent in the yogic map. In the LOT reading we are building here, that root also gathers embodiment, stability, generative force, gravity, survival pressure, and the demand for a life that can actually carry spiritual power. You can hear how different that is from spiritual vanity. Vanity wants a crown before it has a root. It wants visions before character. It wants cosmic language before the body can sit through an ordinary disagreement and keep every sentence from becoming a war. The goddess at the root humiliates that impulse in a beautiful way. She says the sacred begins where the body meets gravity, feet on the ground, pelvis, survival, sex, family, food, fear, belonging. The ordinary pressures that expose where identity is thick. From there, the yogic map rises through increasingly subtle centers and culminates in a union that represents recognition beyond divided identity. Again, this is traditional spiritual geography. It should be taught as such. Modern reports of Kundalini type and spiritually transformative experiences add another layer while leaving the old anatomy as traditional sacred geography. People have described heat, vibration, altered breathing, involuntary movement, changes in sleep, shifts in attention, emotional release, unusual sensory events, bliss, fear, and radical changes in meaning. Those reports establish the experiences as experiences. The metaphysical interpretation remains a separate question. That sentence deserves weight. A person can genuinely experience a powerful current and still have several possible explanations available: contemplative, physiological, psychological, spiritual, or some combination. Discernment protects the sacred from becoming sloppy. The old goddess can withstand careful uncertainty. If an experience is profound, truth can survive careful examination. If the experience changes a person toward clarity, responsibility, love, steadiness, and less compulsive identification, those consequences carry more weight than a dramatic story about heat in the spine. And if the experience comes with prolonged loss of sleep, inability to function, severe distress, frightening physical symptoms, or a collapse in ordinary reality testing, responsible care belongs in the picture. Spiritual language and appropriate professional support can coexist. That boundary strengthens the teaching around Kundalini. It stops the ego from using sacred vocabulary to hide confusion. Now we can ask the more dangerous question: what would it actually mean in this worldview for the goddess to wake? Waking, in the deepest version of this teaching, means Shakti becomes available to recognition along the central path. The power that was folded into ordinary identity begins serving a different center of gravity. Different center of gravity is useful language because awakening can make a person look simpler and more grounded from the outside. A genuine shift can make someone look simpler from the outside. They may speak less compulsively, react with less speed, need less reassurance, carry desire while choice remains present. Power can stay present while audience hunger fades. The spiritual ego hates how ordinary that can look. The ego wants special effects because special effects give it evidence of rank. Kundalini traditions can contain spectacular language, and human beings can report spectacular experiences. Yet the deeper destination is liberation. Liberation has to show up in the relationship between awareness and compulsion. So ask, what wakes? Does sensation wake? Sensation was already happening. Does emotion wake? Emotion was already happening. Does sexual force wake? Sexual force was already moving. Does imagination wake? Imagination may have been running the whole house. The waking refers to concentrated Shakti entering the central liberating orientation of the yogic map. In the non-dual reading here, the person begins recognizing that the force moving through desire, fear, memory, and attention belongs to a reality wider than the contracted self. Desire usually points toward a person, experience, or result. Under the object sits raw force, attraction, imagination, and the wish to move towards something. Recognition brings that deeper layer into view. Fear usually points toward a future that needs to go a certain way. Beneath the future story sits contraction, protection, memory, and life force preparing for action. Anger usually points toward defense, proof, or victory. Beneath the demand sits intelligence and force before identity turns them into a weapon. This gives the conscious being more room to participate deliberately while staying fully involved in life. That room changes relationships. A partner can feel when you become less hungry for them to regulate your identity. An adult child can feel when a parent listens with a softer defense. A friend can feel when spiritual vocabulary stops functioning as armor. Co-workers can feel the difference when pressure meets steadier presence. Kundalini becomes believable in ordinary consequence. That is especially important for someone who has spent decades building a personality that works. Maybe your identity earned money, raised children, survived loss, protected a family, learned a profession, took care of aging parents, stayed useful while carrying private pain. Spiritual language can become insulting when it treats that whole structure like garbage. Tantra can be more precise. That personality did real work. It survived, earned, protected, raised children, kept promises, and got you through things. Awakening simply stops asking that personality to be the whole of you. The useful tool stays available while ultimate reality becomes the deeper identity. This can feel less like destroying a house and more like realizing you have been living in one room of a much larger property. The practical point is simple. The role continues. Ownership becomes lighter. The person can still function fully while the role stops defining the whole field of consciousness. You can still be a mother, father, husband, wife, artist, owner, employee, elder, friend, student, or teacher. Kundalini awakening in a non-dual frame can leave functional social identities intact inside a wider consciousness. It puts those identities inside a wider consciousness. And because Shakti is active power, the change shows up in what receives force. Attention becomes less automatically captured by every irritation. Speech becomes less wasteful. Desire becomes more transparent. Fear becomes easier to recognize before it writes the next decision. Sexual force becomes one current in a larger sacred economy rather than a private emergency. Grief can move while identity stays wider than the wound. Devotion can deepen because the divine is felt as intimate rather than outsourced to a distant authority. The body itself can become more respected because the body is where the teaching is being lived. That last point carries weight as the years accumulate. Spiritual culture can glorify escape from the body at the exact moment a wiser relationship with the body becomes essential. Needs change, sleep changes, recovery changes, parents age, children become adults, friends die, careers shift, time stops feeling theoretical. The body becomes a direct teacher of impermanence. Kundalini teaching should speak into that reality. Sacred power has to survive contact with mortgages, medicine, grief, responsibility, aging, love, and the finite number of years carried by this body. The goddess hides in the spine because the path joins the sacred with the mortal vessel. Awakening leaves mortality in place while changing the identity living through mortality. That can produce a strange kind of courage. The body deserves care precisely because the body is temporary and sacred. The relationship deserves truth because time is real. Attention deserves discipline because years are finite. Desire deserves honesty because every repeated choice becomes part of character. Sushumna can even carry an ethical dimension because centrality shows up as coherence. The yogic image remains a central channel, and the life consequence appears as forces moving in one direction instead of pulling the person into 12 incompatible demands. A person says they want peace while feeding conflict every evening. They say they want God contact while spending every quiet moment avoiding silence. They say they want intimacy while protecting an identity built around radical self-sufficiency. They say they want awakening while secretly wanting spiritual superiority. Those contradictions spend Shakti. The central path asks for coherence. You, as the soul in this body, become responsible for what receives your attention. The body is the laboratory where the cost becomes visible. Clarity can be firm and free of self-hatred. That is why the goddess image can be maternal, fierce, erotic, terrifying, beautiful, and uncompromising across different tantric worlds. Shakti creates and cuts. She nourishes and destroys forms. She gives life and removes structures whose time has ended. The image refuses the childish idea that feminine divinity means softness alone. Kundalini carries that fierceness inward. Waking her in the symbolic and contemplative map means the force that built the limited identity can participate in exposing it. The builder becomes the one who opens the walls. And that brings us to the power test, because a person can feel enormous energy and still fail the deepest lesson completely. Power is where spiritual language gets dangerous. A surge of energy can feel holy, Bliss can feel like final truth. A spontaneous movement can feel like the body has been taken over by intelligence. A vivid dream can feel like instruction. A period of unusual sensitivity can make ordinary spaces feel charged. Some practitioners report heat, pressure, vibration, inner sound, altered perception, emotional release, or currents moving along the body. Those experiences deserve context, observation, and discernment. Experience is experience. Interpretation comes next. The power test asks what the experience does to the person over time. Does it create more responsibility or more entitlement? Does it make the person easier to live with or more demanding? Does it increase humility or produce a private spiritual rank? Does it deepen care for the body or turn the body into an experiment that must endure anything? Does it increase the capacity to hear disagreement or turn disagreement into proof of personal spiritual rank? Those questions can protect decades of spiritual work. A Kundalini experience can become another identity very quickly. The experience becomes a badge. The badge begins deciding who is advanced, who is asleep, who is worthy, and who gets dismissed. The event may have been genuine, while the new identity built around it becomes another contraction. That is the irony. The ego can use awakening language to go back to sleep. So the traditional goal has to stay visible: liberation, recognition, freedom from compulsive identification, greater capacity to live from the deeper ground. Siddhis, visions, unusual perceptions, energy events, and dramatic states may appear in various traditions, but power remains a test. The ultimate reality outranks every display. That line belongs beside Kundalini because the subject attracts hunger. People want to feel something undeniable. They want proof that practice is working. They want a body event strong enough to silence doubt. Doubt can be healthy. Discernment can save a person from turning every internal event into revelation. There is a clean middle position. You can honor the spiritual interpretation and still check the body. You can respect a traditional map and still understand that severe pain, fainting, neurological symptoms, persistent insomnia, mania-like states, or inability to function deserve appropriate professional attention. You can tell a trusted spiritual teacher what is happening, and also tell a qualified clinician what is happening when the situation calls for it. Two forms of care can occupy the same life. That is grounded spirituality. Centuries of subtle body teaching still leave room for ordinary care. The body is the temple in this channel's worldview. Respecting the temple includes discernment. The same principle applies psychologically. If a person becomes convinced that every stranger is sending signs, every disagreement is spiritual attack, or every impulsive decision comes from the goddess, the language has stopped protecting clarity. Inner authority grows together with reality testing, consent, responsibility, and the ability to examine your own interpretation. Shakti is bigger than your first explanation of Shakti. That sentence is worth keeping. The goddess represents active divine power. A human interpretation of an experience is one event inside that power. Humility leaves room for correction. And there is another power test that gets less attention: boredom. Can the sacred survive an ordinary Tuesday? Can your relationship with Shakti survive after the heat settles? Can you honor the body on an ordinary day when sensation stays quiet and life feels completely plain? Can you wash a cup, answer an email, sit beside a tired partner, pay a bill, apologize cleanly, and keep the same reverence? That is where spiritual character becomes visible. The goddess who creates galaxies in the tantric imagination also creates the ordinary. The same Shakti that a yogic map places as awakening potential at the root appears through cooking, work, care, speech, grief, sexuality, aging, and attention. A spirituality that requires constant intensity has become addicted to one flavor of power: Kundalini wisdom has to include the quiet phases. Some periods feel completely ordinary. The person may simply become less reactive. Old appetites may lose some authority. The body may feel easier to inhabit. The need to explain every spiritual event may soften. Silence may become easier to trust. These changes can be more valuable than 1,000 stories about internal fireworks. That makes Kundalini harder to counterfeit and more demanding. It makes the teaching harder to counterfeit. The final power test is ownership. Who is waking whom? When the ego turns awakening into personal possession and spiritual rank, the old owner survives inside a new spiritual identity. If awakening reveals power as belonging to the larger field, the whole sentence changes. Shakti is the power. You, as awareness moving through this form, encounter yourself inside a field of power that precedes the little personal claim. That is why goddess language is so useful. The goddess image exceeds personal achievement and pushes the teaching back towards source. She has agency. She exceeds ego biography. She creates the world you are standing in. She is intimate and vast. Subscribe if you want the library to keep taking tantric body maps this deep. Now the whole map can come together. Why she hides, why she sleeps, how the Nadis carry distributed life force, and what waking means inside the path. Here is the whole map. At the widest level, Shakti names the active power of ultimate reality. She is movement, manifestation, force, expression, and the capacity through which consciousness appears as a world and as this embodied life. Kundalini is Shakti, described in a concentrated yogic form, resting near the root of the central subtle axis as awakening potential. The Nadis are the subtle channels of the traditional energetic body. Ida and Pingala carry the great image of polarity. Sushumna holds the central route associated with liberation. Different texts build this geography differently, so serious study respects variation while keeping the central teaching intact. The goddess sleeps because divine power can be fully active in ordinary life, while the liberating orientation remains latent. She hides because the force is closer than thought. It appears as the energy inside thought itself. She hides in desire because desire usually points at an object and forgets the power doing the desiring. She hides in fear because fear points at a future and forgets the awareness in which the future image appears. She hides in anger because anger points at an enemy and forgets the raw force beneath the story. She hides in sexuality because attraction can become possession before the conscious being recognizes creation force moving through the body. She hides in grief because grief points at absence while love is still moving inside the ache. She hides in speech because words can spend power faster than the speaker recognizes the force behind the mouth. She hides in habit because repetition can make borrowed patterns feel like permanent identity. And she hides in the spine because the yogic map places the mystery on the central embodied axis. The path turns the sacred question into the body you are already moving through. That is the genius of the image. The root joins awakening with foundation. The Nadis join awakening with the distribution of life force. The chakras join awakening with multiple layers of embodied experience. The knots join awakening with conditioning and obstruction. Sushumna joins awakening with central integration. Shakti joins awakening with ultimate reality. So she sleeps becomes a statement about our relationship with the goddess and her power. The power keeps moving while recognition sleeps. The body keeps living while the conscious being can remain identified with a narrow story. Years can pass that way. You can raise a family that way, build a company that way, survive heartbreak that way, become respected that way, learn scriptures that way, meditate that way, pray that way, grow old that way. The human system can become highly functional while the deepest question remains untouched. Who is the one through whom all this power is moving? That question turns the whole teaching back toward ultimate reality. In the non-dual view, Shakti and Shiva are two faces of one reality, consciousness and its capacity to appear, know, move, create, conceal, and recognize. Kundalini symbolism places that cosmic drama inside the body. The power sleeps as contracted potential. It wakes toward recognition. The apparent separation between power and consciousness is drawn back toward unity. This is why the ascent is bigger than upward motion. The real movement is from fragmentation toward recognition, from compulsion toward conscious relationship, from ownership toward participation, from scattered force toward central clarity, from personal ownership toward participation in ultimate reality moving here. That last sentence can humble a person. It can also make the body sacred in a very practical way. The body becomes worth listening to while every sensation stays in context. The mind becomes worth training while thought keeps its proper scale. Desire becomes worth studying while desire stops ruling the whole system. Spiritual experience becomes worth honoring while interpretation stays careful. The whole path grows stronger when devotion and discernment stand together. Everything returns to Shakti because everything is movement. And still, the old image says she sleeps. I love the severity of that. It refuses to flatter activity. Business can coexist with spiritual sleep. Emotional intensity can coexist with spiritual sleep. Sexual intensity can coexist with spiritual sleep. Spiritual information can accumulate inside spiritual sleep. Charisma can shine inside spiritual sleep. A powerful sensation can occur inside spiritual sleep. Even a genuine mystical event can become another dream if the old identity immediately claims it. Wakefulness has to penetrate ownership. That is why the goddess is fierce. She takes the power you use to decorate the self and turns it back toward the source. She can appear beautiful because recognition carries bliss. She can appear terrifying because the identity built from years of repetition experiences loosening as a threat. She can appear erotic because Shakti is creation force. She can appear maternal because life is held in her. She can appear destructive because forms end. The tantric feminine is large enough to hold all of that. So when you see an image of a coiled serpent at the root, read it as a compressed spiritual teaching rather than a biological wire. See a compressed teaching. The coil says potential. The root says embodiment. The serpent says living intelligence and transformative force. The central channel says there is another orientation available. The ascent says identity can be reorganized. The union presents power and source as one reality viewed through two faces. And the word sleep says all of this can remain hidden while you continue living a completely recognizable human life. That should change the way the sleeping goddess image feels. Why does the goddess hide in your spine? Because the body is where the cosmic power becomes intimate. Why does she sleep? Because Shakti can animate the entire person while Kundalini remains latent as the force of central awakening. What are the Nadis doing? They give the tradition a language for the distribution of prana through the subtle body, with Ida and Pingala expressing polarity and Sushumna holding the privileged central root. What does waking mean? It means the force begins serving recognition rather than endlessly reinforcing contraction. It means the person becomes less fascinated with possessing power and more transparent to the source of power. It means the goddess moves from hidden possibility to lived spiritual reorganization. After all the beautiful language, the life gives the clearest evidence. Fear tells you something through the way it is handled. Desire tells you something through the freedom surrounding it. Power tells you something through responsibility. The body tells you something through the care it receives. Relationships tell you something through the quality of presence. Spiritual identity tells you something through its weight. Love becomes cleaner as possession loosens. Strength becomes cleaner as domination loosens. Devotion becomes cleaner as fear loosens. And silence becomes easier to inhabit as compulsive explanation loses authority. Those fruits protect the mystery from sloppy interpretation. They keep the mystery honest. Now picture one old city before sunrise. Every narrow street is already alive. Bakers are working. Doors open. Water moves through pipes. Lamps burn in upstairs windows. Messages travel from one edge of the city to another. The city has been alive all night. At the oldest gate sits a queen the city has nearly forgotten how to recognize. Her roads have been carrying her power all night. Her people have been living from that power all night. Her name has been spoken in fragments, in hunger, in love, in fear, in birth, in sex, in grief, in prayer, in every movement of the city. Then morning comes. The queen stands. Morning reorganizes what was already alive inside the walls. The source of life was already present throughout the city. The roads turn toward their center. The streets that felt separate reveal one kingdom. The power that was everywhere becomes consciously known at the throne.